Anyway, it's about halfway through my time, so I thought maybe I could turn it open now for questions. And the questions, by the way, don't have to be about anything that I talked about it. In fact, if nobody asks me about it, then I don't have to talk about it anymore. But I'm happy to talk about that stuff, but I'm also happy to talk about anything else that you think is interesting.
Do you think there's going to be increasing pushback from consumers and regulators coming on the privacy side of all this? You know, as we're collecting more data and sharing it with more people and all that kind of thing. It seems up to this point that people are either unaware of it or have seen the value in providing that data, but consumers might not want to do that, or regulators might try and put the brakes on that to some extent.
Right. So there's sort of two issues that you bring up that I think are different issues. They're both important issues, but one is our data, which is truly our data and is in theory private. And I say in theory because I'm talking about things like our Gmail data and our Google Calendar data and our search query data and things like that. When we put our email in the cloud and use Google's technology to do our email, we're not necessarily sharing that email with anybody else except for the people that we're emailing with. But nobody should have access to my inbox or your inbox. Now, you know, it could get hacked. Someone could get our password, get in and see our email, but that's a slightly different privacy issue. That is one. So that issue, I think, is that data is private. We are making a conscious decision to use a cloud-based platform. We are giving that data to be used by somebody like Google for our benefit, and that has some privacy considerations, but I think they're not really complicated and not likely to be subject to a ton of regulation. The second issue is around the more public kind of sharing that we do, the kinds of sharing that we do on Facebook or Twitter, and more broadly in the social web. And that I think is a more complicated problem because that is data that we are making public, and the way that data is used, either for our benefit or not for our benefit, to target advertising at us or target advertising at other people that we're connected to, or potentially having that data sold to third parties, is an area that I think is potentially much more, well, it's much more likely to get regulated. And in some ways I'm sort of surprised that we don't have more regulations around that right now. So I think probably both areas will be targets for people to make, you know, more sort of consumer protection regulations, but I think it's the more public sharing area which I think is potentially the most problematic.
So while we were speaking, I was thinking of two things. One of them is just a comment. I was just thinking of Ray Kurzweil, because a lot of the things that he said is actually very close to what he is envisioning as the development of as these technologies get more and more sophisticated.
Right.
Now, the question is then, like, why do you think now is the time? Because Google Glass is the very first product that is getting even closer to our body as opposed to having just a phone. Right. And you know, the fact that these, you just said that, you know, the apps that will operate on these platforms are of interest to you guys. Why do you guys think like Google Glass, for example, isn't necessarily going to be successful?
I'm not sure that Google Glass is going to be necessarily successful, but it's not just Google Glass, it's the Pebble Watch, it's the rumor that Apple's working on a watch. I think there's enough signals that I'm seeing. I could be misreading them, by the way, you know, this is just my opinion, right? But there's enough signals that I'm seeing that indicate to me that feels like the direction we're headed. We're headed in a direction of lower and lower cost. I mean, I recognize that the first Google Glass units are going to be $1,500. So obviously that's not inexpensive. But if you could get that capability for $50 or $75, if you could get the watch for $25 or $50, I think what we're going to see is that these are going to be less powerful, more application-specific types of devices, and I think that there's going to be lots of them. I just feel like that's the direction that this whole world is heading in. And I agree with you that it is very much sort of the Ray Kurzweil singularity kind of vision. I sort of was a skeptic of it for a long time, but I'm starting to see the pieces come together, and it feels like maybe he's closer to where we're headed than I thought.
Well, before the machines fully take over, and I, for one, welcome our machine overlords. You spoke last year about one of your portfolio investments, Work Market. There's a lot of articles being written about the changing face of the workplace and of the work of workers. I'm just curious, kind of as an update from last year, has anything changed? Do you see any trends kind of that are just coming about now as far as how workers are managed or allocated or beyond?
No, I the big question, that I've been thinking a lot about is, where are all the jobs, right? And I do think that we're seeing a pretty fundamental transformation from, full-time employment, the 40-hour work week, single company, single employer, to a much more of a freelance type of model. And that, I think, is going to be a big change. And I think that it's harder to count those jobs. And so when we look at the labor statistics, and there isn't a lot of job growth, but yet you see that other economic indicators like retail spending or people buying homes seem to be moving in the right direction. You say, well, wait a second. If nobody has any, if job growth is non-existent, and you still have 8 or 9% of the country unemployed, and that's just the people who are actually looking for work. That doesn't include all the people who've giving up for work. But at the same time, you see retail sales on the rebound. You see home buying back on the rebound, and it's not coming from a credit binge because total credit outstanding is declining. Like, so what's going on, right? And one of the theories, I'm not an economist, but one of the theories is the changing nature of work. That people are getting income in other ways, and it's not being picked up in the Labor Department statistics, but yet it is being felt in people's pocketbooks. And we see some of this and I think, I'm not suggesting that the companies that I mention are the drivers of this, but you see it in things like Airbnb, people renting out, the second bedroom in their apartment, or you see it in Lyft and Sidecar, people like getting in their car and driving people, kind of being a taxi driver, for 4 or 6 or 8 hours, once or twice a week. You see it in people selling on Etsy and maybe supplementing their income. If it's a single, one parent staying home, other parent working, using things like Etsy to supplement your income, or TaskRabbit, or any of these companies, right? So I think we're early on in this trend, but I think this all gets to sort of the changing nature of work, and people may be doing a number of these things, teaching classes on Skillshare, or cooking 2 nights a week on Kitchen Surfing, or whatever it might be. And if you follow these trends, in down 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, a number of these companies are going to be very large, and none of the people who are getting income from these companies are going to be getting income in a traditional employer-employee relationship. And so, I think we're not early on in the trend of freelance labor, because there's always been freelance labor, but I think we're early on in the trend of maybe the mainstreaming of freelance labor, and that maybe, you know, a 40-hour-a-week permanent full-time job could be, you know, the minority of the population in 20 or 30 years. So that's what we're thinking. Go all the way over.
So we know that for some time you've been developing a healthcare investment thesis, and you touched on three things that I think are particularly important to healthcare. One, the privacy issue that Owen brought up, machine learning and aggregation of data. I just want to ask you about, you know, an update on your thoughts on healthcare and whether you think, what are your thoughts on those three things as they apply to the direction that healthcare is moving?
We haven't made any investments in healthcare yet, and I don't even think we're making much progress getting to making investments in healthcare. But I'm not sure that that's anybody's fault but our own. We just haven't seen anything that reminds us of other things that we have done in the past that have turned out to be smart things. And it's very difficult for us, and I just speak us in terms of the partnership at Union Square Ventures. It's difficult for us to make an investment in something that is completely foreign and you know, kind of brand new territory. We want to see something that reminds us of something. So, you know, in education, for example, Edmodo kind of reminded us of social networks like Twitter and Tumblr and Facebook. So that was kind of easy for us to wrap our head around. And Skillshare reminded us a little bit of Etsy. And you know, Codecademy reminded us a little bit of Stack Overflow. So like it was easier for us to make those education investments. While education was new for us, the architecture of the product and the business model and you know, the way that it was being delivered to the market was familiar to us. But we haven't seen that so much in healthcare. And I don't know whether it's because of, you know, the specifics of healthcare. I mean, there are some things in healthcare like wellness and services that are helping people live healthier lives, and there are communities out there for people who have certain kinds of chronic diseases and things like that. So there are some things that probably do look a little bit like things that we've invested in other sectors, but you know, for whatever reason, we haven't gotten the enthusiasm to make any of those investments.
So in the makers movement, it still feels like definitely people are working on the technology. Just how do you get it affordably onto your desktop? I haven't seen as many people really thinking about what we actually do when it's in our house.
You're talking about something like a 3D printer?
Yeah, specifically.
Yeah, I'm not sure everybody's going to have a 3D printer on their desk. They may, or they may not, right? I mean, I'm sure back in the early days of laser printers, people would say, well, we'll never have laser printers on our desk. And of course, a lot of us do, or at least we have inkjet printers on our desks. So I'm not sure we're all going to have 3D printers on our desk unless, you know, unless someone comes up with an application for 3D printing that requires us to be printing something every day, you know. It might not be necessary. You know, our only 3D printing investment is in a company called Shapeways, which provides two things to the market that are kind of the same thing. One is virtual printing, like sort of Kinko's for 3D printing. You do the 3D model, post it to Shapeways, and tell them you want 5 printed or 10 printed, and they're going to show up, you know, a week later. And the ability for other people to print your models, and you get paid for that. And the reason it's the same thing is that once you post your model to Shapeways, it doesn't matter whether you're printing it and paying for it or some third party's printing and paying for it, except for the fact that you would get a piece of the revenue if it was a third party. So we like that investment for a bunch of reasons, but one of the reasons we like the investment is we're not sure that everybody's going to have a 3D printer. And the other thing that's happening with 3D printing is that the technology is changing so fast For example, larger format 3D printing, smaller format 3D printing, multiple materials in a single print run, new materials that beforehand were never able to be printed. And so I think the innovation curve is way, way too steep for most people to be able to justify buying one, because they'll buy something and it'll be obsolete in a year, and most people don't want to spend that kind of money on something that might be obsolete in a year. So I don't really know whether the maker movement is gonna be so profound that all of us are going to be makers and all of us are going to be, having, our manufacturing in our homes and offices. But I do think that the whole concept of just-in-time manufacturing and being able to, create on demand is going to impact a lot of things. I think 3D printing is a very impactful technology. And I'm not saying that the only good investment in 3D printing is Shapeways. I'm just saying it's the only one we've made. But I'm not sure that it's going to all end up in that we're all going to be doing it.
You've written a lot recently about HBO and Netflix, in particular with the launch of House of Cards.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a huge fan of the show, but one thing I did sort of miss while binging on it was the ability to go to Twitter or Facebook and participate in sort of the conversation and dialogue about what I was seeing. What do you think sort of that, how do you think sort of Netflix sort of handles that experience? Or do you think just sort of the trend and the idea that people want to have total control of when they watch things is too overwhelming?
It's a great question. I mean, it's a brand new paradigm. I mean, it's not really true. It's not a brand new paradigm, because I think for most of us, since on-demand has come along and DVRs have come along, I think we've been sort of hacking, I certainly have, and I'm sure most of you have too, been sort of hacking the way that television's been delivered so that we could consume it more in a linear experience. And we've all had the experience of getting into a TV show a year or two or three in and going back and watching the first 2 or 3 seasons, over the course of a long weekend or something. So I think the behavior is not brand new, but I think the idea that an entertainment company would consciously choose to deliver their programming in this way is new. And I think there's a lot of discussion about whether this is the right model or not. As a consumer of it, I personally feel it's a better model, that I can choose when I want to get into the show, when I want to watch it, not having to worry about DVRing it or getting it on demand. All that sort of thought process goes out the window. I just can watch it whenever I want to watch it. I think it's a better user experience, but I do agree that we will lose the water cooler effect, or whatever you want to call it, where people have this shared experience of coming in the next morning and talking about, the episode that aired last night. So maybe companies will compete on that basis. Maybe some companies will continue to put out content in the old model because they want to benefit from the water cooler effect, and other companies will compete with this model. I don't know. I think it's too early to know. What the thing that I'm most excited about in the whole HBO versus Netflix and House of Cards thing is that a company like Netflix, which has no connection to the traditional world of television, whether it's broadcast or cable, can make high quality television. And I've always thought that would be the case, that it's not only the the legacy entertainment companies who have existing sort of entrenched interests can do this kind of thing. And so that's very heartening to me, because that means that they'll be the innovators and they will be able to attract our dollars, and they'll be able to use those dollars to not only create great programming, but innovate in delivery, and that we'll be able to watch these things on whatever devices we want to watch. I mean, one of the awesome things about Netflix is there is a Netflix client on almost every thing I can think of. It's on phones, it's on tablets, it's on smart TVs, connected TVs, it's on Apple TV. It's on it's on Xbox. It's like everywhere, right? So you don't have to think about where am I going to watch House of Cards. Watch it wherever I want, and I think that's really awesome. So that's what I'm most excited about of all.
A bit more of a personal question. Over the last roughly year, you've extended into some political topics, gun control,
Right.
and PIPA and SOPA.
Right.
And you've also talked about over the last year that it's not been a great year for you. I'm curious to know if there's any more than correlation, but perhaps causality.
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. I think that last year was a tough year for me because it was the first year in a long, long time that I didn't make any new investments, and that was, I think, related to two things. One, I had made 4 investments the year before, all in very young companies, and I already had, even before I made those 4 investments, a dozen portfolio companies that I was on the board of and working hard on, and we just haven't sold any companies. So, I just really got overcommitted in a big way, and I just had to stop making new investments because I wasn't going to be able to live up to the commitments that I had made to those entrepreneurs. So that was thing one. And then thing two was that I also wasn't sure. I needed a story, kind of like the story I told at the beginning of this session, not for all of you, but for my own benefit, about what I wanted to go invest in. And I'd had that story for a long time. It was a similar story, or maybe 2 stories, around social media and internet marketplaces that led to things like Twitter and SoundCloud and Zynga on one hand, and sort of the social media vector and blogging stuff, and then marketplaces like Etsy and Kickstarter on the other, and those were themes that I had been working for maybe as far back as 8 or 9 years, and I started to feel like some of those themes, not all those themes, but some of those themes were getting kind of long in the tooth, and so I needed to come up with some new material. And it took me the better part of last year to even start to think about what that new material might be. And so I think that those are the 2 things that really kind of made last year a difficult year. And then there was some personal things like getting washed out of our home from the hurricane and things like that sort of added fuel to the fire. But I don't think the political stuff has put me in a bad mood. I mean, politics is frustrating. Trying to, and I don't think of the stuff that we're working on in the political realm is not, trying to get this person elected over this person elected. It's really more policy stuff. We need to change our immigration policy. We need to change, our patent policy. We need to change our copyright policy. There's a lot of things that we think are important to change for the benefit of entrepreneurs, technology, society, whatever. And it's very difficult to change people's minds on these things. I heard somebody say that that there was some small changes in the patent, the laws that govern the patent system in this country last year, and I heard someone say, that's it for the next 10 or 15 years. Like, there won't be any more changes in patent law for the next 10 or 15 years. Like, Congress did its thing, and they're not going to do anything more. Like, that's the kind of thing that's frustrating. You're like, that's all we got? There's nothing more? We can't get anything more done, So, I think you can get frustrated with this stuff, but I don't think that that's necessarily led to having a bad year.
Can you talk a little bit more about machine learning specifically, like the kinds of platforms you'd like to see in it? Like ideally, if all the technology were there, like what would you like to see?
Well, one thing I'd like to see is I'd like to make it more. I like machine learning technology to become easier for the average person to access, right? So one of the cool things about blogging was that blogging made it possible for pretty much anybody who wanted to be a publisher or a journalist to be able to do it, right? It made it like drop dead simple. And we can all do it, not to say that we all will do it, because writing in itself is a lot of work, but if any of us wanted to, we could do it. Like, to get on one of these blogging platforms and set up a blog and start writing, like, that's not hard. And it would be really cool if machine learning became that accessible, so that anybody could play with it, you know, and build routines and algorithms, and create data sets and do that kind of work. And because I think that the amount of, I mean, a good example of this is any of these creative platforms, like blogging platforms, or online photography platforms, or these drawing platforms that you're starting to see emerge on tablets, opens up a lot of creativity, much more creativity than we would see in a world where that stuff was harder and more expensive to do. And so if we made it possible for all of us to play around with machine learning, then we would probably get things, people would be making things with machine learning technology that the scientists who are required to build that stuff today couldn't imagine, because they're scientists.
So you talked about the changing nature of work and the concept of BYOD, bring your own device into the workplace, is something I hear a lot in discussions come up recently especially. So can you talk a little bit about the sort of enterprise side of that equation, the business side? So what are businesses doing to face the changing nature of work, and have you been looking at, do you have the sort of thoughts around what investments might look like there to help businesses deal with that?
So I'm not a great enterprise technology investor. So the last part of your question would be the part that I would probably struggle with the most. I absolutely think that the paradigm is shifted for many companies, not all companies, but for many companies, where instead of, if you work for our company, you're going to use a BlackBerry and a ThinkPad, and that's what it is, and I don't care what you use at home, but when you're working for us, that's the platform you're going to use, to one where you want to use an iPhone, use an iPhone. If you want to use a MacBook, you use a MacBook. If you want to use a ThinkPad, use a ThinkPad. So many companies are definitely flipped to a model where the IT organizations are going to support the technology that their employees want to use, as opposed to dictating to their employees what they're going to use. So that I think is a trend that is probably not reversible. And so then the question is, what do enterprises do about that? Well, I think maybe one answer is become less. Maybe support those. Obviously you need security and things like that. But if the users are going to want to bring their own technology into the workforce, maybe you don't spend as much money supporting all that. Maybe that's actually a cost savings opportunity. The employees are expected to support themselves a little bit more. Or maybe lighter weight forms of support, maybe more using more online tools or things like that. The security problem is a particularly thorny problem, because obviously employees are sharing a lot of corporate information that needs to be protected, and I don't really have a lot of good thoughts on that. But I do think it's probably a very lucrative area to be looking at, because it's a problem that these companies are probably not at this point in time all that well equipped to deal with.
So you touched on EdTech a little bit before, and it seems like in the last year, platforms like Coursera, Udacity, and edX, they've gained a lot of traction as potential scalable models for how to do higher ed. But it seems like, particularly in higher ed, until they deal with kind of the issue of credentialing, that it's going to be hard for them to have like an actual market impact. Do Do you think that they're kind of on track to do it with kind of the certificates they're doing, or is there something else that they have to do before, they can really actually start to do some kind of real replacement?
Well, the education industry in this country is highly regulated, and the area where the rubber really meets the road is accreditation and credentialing, actually being able to issue a degree, certify that degree. And so the real question is whether or not, and the government, is basically in cahoots. If we talk about higher ed, the government's basically in cahoots with the higher education industry and in a way protecting, their incumbency by the accreditation system. And so, I think the higher education industry's got to have to decide whether they want to, really lower the cost of education by using these online tools, and actually, go all the way in issuing degrees to people who are availing themselves of these lower cost methods. I think it's going to happen, but I think it's probably less likely to happen at the very high end, just because I think that these institutions are probably less at risk. Any school or any business that has 10 or 20 times the number of people who want to be customers as get to be customers is probably not at risk of going out of business tomorrow. So I think until the number of people who want to go to NYU or Harvard is less than the number of seats they want to fill, they're not going to be in a hurry to commoditize, what they're charging for a degree. Now, I think they ought. If I were in their shoes, to some extent I am because I'm on the board of NYU, I would be pushing to move much more quickly. There's a guy who reads my blog who calls himself Fake Grimlock. He's a dinosaur. I'm not joking. And he has a great line which I really like a lot. He says, "When all the houses are going to be set on fire, you should set your house on fire first." And I like that line. I think that's what people in the higher ed business should do. One more question. All the way in the back.
Yeah, there's been a lot of articles written in the New York Times, The Atlantic, just about the effects of Google and all these other applications of machine learning they go to, and what that's doing to the human brain and intelligence, etc. Can you talk a little bit about that, about some of these side effects that may not be important? You talk about a lot of the good things, but is there any negative things that we should be worried about?
I'm certain that there's huge impacts to the human brain, and I don't know whether they're good or bad. It's probably a little of both, right? Like all things in life, there's positives and negatives. There's a great Albert Einstein quote that I really like. So I quoted a fake dinosaur, now I'm quoting a Nobel Prize winner. And he said something like, "I don't need to remember anything, I just need to know where to find it." I think something like that. And I kind of feel like that's part of what's happened. I don't actually remember what my day is going to be like tomorrow, but I know it's right here, I can get to it. So I don't bother to commit that to memory anymore. And I see it in my kids, who are in high school and college, and they approach learning things differently because they know that the answers to a lot of these questions are at their fingertips and always will be. So it seems to me like they work more on how to figure out how to get the answer as opposed to how to commit the answer to memory. And so, I think the machines are probably changing the way our brains function as much as we're changing how the machines' brains function. And some people are probably up in arms about that, and some people are probably very blasé about that, and I guess my view, probably the right answer is somewhere in between. We should be concerned about it, and also we should be excited by it. We're going to lose some stuff, and we're going to gain some stuff, but we're going to evolve.
Fred, much appreciated. This is Brian Ballon's company. This is AandBAmerican.com, and hopefully later on you can try some.
Is this like really super spicy?
No, it's very good.
Oh,
It's really delicious.
You
You
know,
can probably
right?
drink it out of the bottle.
Oh
No,
my
I
God.
wouldn't do that just now. But it is really good. It's got a lot of flavor. It's not
Smells
too
good.
spicy. It really tastes like the pepper does. Is that close?
That's exactly what I was.
Thank you.